What if the most feared predator of the deep suddenly became vulnerable at its strongest hour? For the U-boat night was their sanctuary, their cloak of invisibility. But one game-changing innovation ripped that cloak away, giving Allied forces an unprecedented edge. Can you guess the secret weapon that turned the tide of the war under the cover of darkness? Night fell like a curtain over the North Atlantic, a black sheet pulled taut from horizon to horizon. Convoys moved under it, slow and low, merchant hulls riding in measured columns, their lights strict and few discipline born of fear. Above the water the world was blind. Below it the escorts listened with echoing patience. Their hydrophones and early sonar whispered presence depth, the soft geometry of a submarine walking the deep. But on the surface, the hunters moved with a freedom the convoy could not match. Submarines rode the night like kings of a shadowed road, faster on the surface, able to save battery and reach patrol lanes, choosing hour and angle with the casual cruelty of predators. Night was their trade, the ocean became a dark highway for ambush. For years the balance favored the vanishers. Radar could not yet pierce the belt of dark at the ranges that mattered for small ships. Aircraft of the early war could detect something at a distance, but the small, fast silhouette of a surfaced U-boat often melted into the last yards before a visual could be closed. Escorts chased echoes, found empty sea, and cursed the blind cone that sat between detection and sight. The tactical consequence was simple and brutal: stragglers taken before help could arrive, captains waking to flares and concussion instead of warning. Convoy commanders built doctrine around that reality: routes blackout discipline, zigzag patterns, and a generation of escort captains learned to respect the night. Then, the night began to betray its masters. It did not happen as a single flash of genius. It happened as a series of stubborn practical fixes: radio engineers pushing wavelengths smaller, signal men adapting displays, shipwrights squeezing receivers into cramped bridges, and a willingness to graft new gear onto working ships. The first time an escort held a contact through dusk, and into the black the men on her bridge felt the rules of engagement change under their hands. An echo that had been a hint became a leash. A ghost on a screen became a trail to follow. Where before the submarine could choose the moment of attack, now the escort could choose the moment of closure. Imagine a destroyer steaming slow into the night, bridge lights dim the sea, a wall of black. On the plotting table, a small green smear hangs like a promise. The officer of the watch watches it move, not a rumour but a thing with a bearing and a rate. The ship alters course. Funnels and wakes draw into a chase line. The men strain at sightlines, wait for a shape to resolve against a darker shape, and then, because the ship has kept the echo, the silhouette steadies and the attack begins. The thunder that follows is less a surprise, and more an answer to a long-suppressed question: the hunter can be hunted. That inversion had consequences beyond any single night. It redefined risk for crews who had trusted darkness. It forced doctrines to be rewritten and countermeasures to be rushed. It turned oceans that had been safe at certain hours into contested space. It made surfacing a calculated gamble. The change was surgical, not revolutionary in rhetoric, but revolutionary in effect. Where once the U-boat rode free beneath stars, now the sea could betray it with a pulse of radio, a steady hand on a ship's wheel, and a captain who knew how to trust a blip. This is the precise hinge of the story, the practical tweak that allowed a fighting ship to keep watch at night. What follows is how engineers narrowed the beam, how sailors learned to use it, and how that narrow beam unraveled the illusion that darkness was sanctuary. The work began in laboratories and on drawing boards. Physicists argued in clipped sentences. Engineers bent over coils and vacuum tubes. The need was plain. The ocean at night offered cover, and convoy commanders begged for sight. The inventors promised a new kind of sight that did not rely on eyes. Early radar was crude and heavy. Sets filled aircraft bellies and ship cabins. They painted a blot on endurance and on operational range. Returns were jagged and noisy. Still, a blip was better than nothing. A smear on a scope became a bearing, then a vector, then a reason to steer. Men learned to read arcs and spikes. The instrument taught them a new language of the sea. The decisive shift came when wavelength fell and power found a purer beam. Shorter wavelengths meant narrower beams and finer definition. Smaller antennas meant flexible mounts and less drag on speed. The cavity magnetron coaxed centimetric power into the air in 1940. That small device made centimetric radar practicable, not only in aircraft but on fighting ships. A compact surface search set could ride on a corvette mast or a destroyer bridge without crippling seakeeping. A low metal hull could be seen at ranges that gave time to close. That few miles of warning transformed decision-making. What had been a rumor on a scope became a plotted course and an intercept in minutes. The technology required procedures. Radar operators became scouts. Plotting rooms turned smears into vectors. Captains timed turns by numbers instead of by sight. Training multiplied the value of hardware. A well-drilled crew with an early set routinely outperformed a careless crew with a later model. Doctrine was written at sea in salt spray and in the dark. Radar had a fault line. Transmitters could blind receivers at close range and swamp the screen in a wash of signal. Sea clutter and heavy weather produced false echoes. Men closed to a return and lost it. Pilots descended to a locus and found only black. The last few hundred yards remained treacherous. The remedies were practical and sometimes brutal. One answer married radio to light. Aircraft fitted with powerful searchlights timed their bursts to the last radar cue so that darkness broke like glass. The sudden white revealed a hull and a scramble. The searchlight turned a blip into a visible contact and shortened the window for escape. Another answer was doctrinal. Pilots learned to fly on instruments and on a needle that pointed to a target they could not yet see. Escorts learned to steer to the plot to make small timed corrections that kept a return under the antenna main lobe. Convoy formations and zigzag patterns were adjusted so that a detected contact offered not a single prey but a defended locus. Detection became a choreography. The sea pushed back. Submarines experimented with painted decks and exhaust tricks. They tried running submerged in daylight and introduced devices to lessen returns. Radio discipline and snorkel trials followed. The contest became a rhythm of measure and countermeasure. Each advance demanded another advance. The change was not uniform. Production bottlenecks and training gaps left some units weeks or months behind others. Still, the pattern was plain centimetric radar, and the procedures born to use it contracted the dark. Detection became a commodity that could be shared across aircraft escorts and plot rooms. Night ceased to be an absolute sanctuary and became instead a contested network of beams, bearings, and decisions. A centimetric pulse on a screen became the beginning of a plan. The radar operator watched a smear move and called a bearing. The plotting team drew a line. The captain set a course. What had been a hint turned into a navigation problem and then into a decision to press or to keep station. Small corrections kept the return under the antenna main lobe. Steering was gentle and deliberate. Haste threw away a contact. Tracking was a discipline. One ship held the echo while another ran the intercept. Bearings and rate of change mattered as much as amplitude. Officers learned to read movement like a language. They judged whether an echo was a wake, a wave, or a conning tower. They timed corrections so that a contact stayed in the beam, while a second ship closed from an axis the submarine could not easily escape. Vectoring depended on prediction. Escorts calculated intercepts from bearing changes and estimated speed. They did not wait to see a hull. They maneuvered to cut off likely tracks and to force a decision. When aircraft were present, they formed a box. A plane held a track from above while a ship closed from the flank. When aircraft were absent, the escort chain became the box one ship, to hold one to close and another to cover the convoy. The choreography turned detection into force concentration. Weapon solution followed pattern. Radar bearings cued depth charges and hedgehog runs. Fire teams practiced timed runs tied to reported speed and bearing. One ship might run a shallow pattern to force a dive. Another might hold contact and bring sonar to bear when the submarine went under. The aim was to deny the enemy a safe window on the surface and to convert surprise into pressure. There were hard limits. The transmitter blind cone remained. False returns punished recklessness. Heavy seas and rain masked a periscope. A misread course could mean a pass-by or a collision. Training and repetition smoothed those edges. Crews turned procedures into habit and habit into survival. On one long night, an escort steaming dark kept a tiny green smear on its plotting board. The return slipped and returned again. The captain held course, trusting the numbers. A second escort closed from the starboard quarter. A flash of searchlight far off cut the sea. Men on the bridge saw a dark hull spill white. Depth charges ran, and then found their mark. The convoy passed without loss that night. Men who had once cursed the blind hours began to speak of nights when the horizon belonged to the hunters. On another night, aircraft vectored an escort to a track. The plane held overhead and fed bearings. The escort kept the echo through a weather band that made the scope jitter. Close in the periscope showed for a heartbeat, then vanished. The escort held, then sonar thumped, and a coordinated pattern followed. The submarine broke off and fled for deep water. The convoy altered its course by a few degrees and went on. Command and networks multiplied the tactical effect. Coastal plotting rooms accepted a bearing and pushed vectors to nearby escorts. A plane on patrol could hand a contact to a ship miles away and then return to scanning. Detection became a shared commodity, and the hunt moved from isolated clashes to coordinated responses. Night on the North Atlantic is a moving wall. Wind pushes spray into the eyes. Smoke from the convoy hangs low and mean. Somewhere beyond the dark line of the horizon, a periscope waits. The destroyer bridge is quiet except for bearings called in a flat voice. The set hums, the scope blooms. A thin trace appears and holds. The first trick was crude and brave. Royal Navy crews learned to turn the entire ship into a scanning platform. Type 286M worked on meter waves and carried a fixed aerial. No plan position indicator. No sweeping arm. You kept the target by keeping the bow pointed at the echo. Helmsman and radar operator moved as one body. A degree lost on the compass meant a lost contact in the noise. It was not elegant. It was effective. Convoy HX, 112 the 17th of March, 1941. Destroyer Vanok runs blacked-out water. The operator calls a hard return ahead. The officer of the watch orders a fine turn to keep the echo dead on the nose. 1,000 yards. The trace thickens, then fades, then returns. The sea is rising. The aerial is wet. The bearing holds. The captain chooses speed over subtlety. Engines answer. Bow wave climbs. At the last moment, the U-boat breaks black from the trough. The destroyer commits. Steel meets steel. The night erupts in splinters and foam. That collision was not a mere accident of courage. It was the proof that radar, even on long waves and without a plan position indicator, could anchor a night intercept. The crew had discovered a logic of angles. Keep the target inside the main lobe. Cut in from the bow. Shorten the range until there is no range left to shorten. Gun flashes follow. Searchlights stay cold. Surprise lives with silence. Word spread through mess decks and wardrooms. Bearing rate mattered more than raw speed. Sea clutter could be ridden like a current if the helm was steady. The operator learned to hear the picture as well as see it. The plotter learned to trust a thin line for longer than felt comfortable. A pattern formed. Contact at extreme short range. A quiet approach with small corrections. A hard close when the echo began to smear. Hedgehog stood ready on the forecastle, and depth charges sat fat and heavy on the rails. The destroyer became a blade in the dark. By late 1942, the centimetric sets began to arrive. Type 271 turned night into geometry. A plan position indicator laid the sea flat, and a cheese antenna cut the beam thin. A conning officer could now hold a true intercept rather than a blind charge. But the lesson from the earlier fights did not fade. The trick remained the same at heart. Keep the lobe. Keep the bearing. Keep the pressure until the enemy must choose between diving blind or surfacing, to breathe and die. The night did not belong to the U-boat anymore. It belonged to the ship that could see without light and steer by a whisper. Night patrols produced scenes that read like instruction and like confession. In late 1942, a Royal Navy destroyer steaming with a convoy picked a faint trace on its surface search screen. The radar operator watched the smear and spoke a bearing in a calm voice. Men at the plotting table drew a course, and the captain ordered a steady change of heading. The ship paired speed and held the echo, while a second escort shaped an intercept from the flank. For minutes, the return winked and returned. Motion revealed truth. A band of wavering return resolved into a dark hull. The first ship ran a shallow pressure pattern. The second ship ran a deeper strike. Depth charges fell in timed sequences that matched the reported speed and bearing. The submarine ceased its surface, run and dove into the waiting water. The convoy altered its tracks and sailed on without loss that night. Men later described the watch as a long minute of very small decisions that together made the difference. In a moonless hour in early 1943, a patrol aircraft found a target on its centimetric screen and steadied on instruments. The operator called precise bearings and the pilot held a run on the needle. A destroyer on a nearby bearing acknowledged and turned to intercept. At the last radar cue, the aircraft switched a searchlight and the sea became a sudden, brutal white. A silhouette showed, and the submarine crew scrambled beneath a glare they had not expected. The destroyer, guided by its own surface search set, and by the airborne bearings, closed through darkness and set a coordinated pattern. A Hedgehog salvo struck where the plotting had promised a hull. The submarine broke contact and then failed to regain it. The convoy preserved its wake. Aircraft and escorts acted as separate killers and as parts of a single machine. A plane could convert a detection into an immediate visible contact and force an instant decision. A ship could hold a contact alone and prosecute to depth. More often they worked in sequence and in concert: radar detection, a vectored handoff, a closing run from sea, while air power limited escape. Destroyer radar operated when aircraft were absent, and it amplified the effect when aircraft were present. Coordination turned single blips into cordons, and cordons into sustained pressure. Those nights were not clean victories. Errors happened. A pilot might illuminate a patch of breakers and waste ordnance. An escort might misjudge a pass and lose a track. Yet repetition hardened procedure. Crews learned to trust numbers to steer small corrections to time attacks to the second. The human work of practice turned fragile technology into a reliable instrument of pressure. The night hunt thus became a choreography of detection, movement, and closing force that favored persistence and precision. The ocean north of the Azores, the last hour of October, 1943, becoming the first hour of November. A thin moon. A cold wind. Destroyer Bory of the United States Navy runs a surface search with SG centimetric radar. The plan position indicator paints a small return at 8,000 yards. It holds steady. It drifts a hair to starboard. The conning officer calls for a bow cut to close on the target's line of movement. The picture tightens as the range falls. 6,000 yards, 4,000 yards, 2,800 yards. Sea return swells along the edge of the display, and the contact begins to smear into the clutter. The captain orders the handoff. Sonar takes the lead. The ship glides to silent running. The sea thumps the plates. The screws ease. The operator counts seconds and calls bearing changes in a calm, dry voice. There is no spectacle. There is only procedure. Depth charges go first. A short pattern. The water lifts and drops. Air hisses through shattered ballast. The U-boat is forced up by pressure and damage. Black hull breaks the surface. The destroyer turns hard and presses in. 4-inch guns speak. 20mm mounts stitch white arcs across the conning tower. The enemy tries to turn inside the wake. Lines foul. Steel scrapes steel. The two hulls grind together in a chaos of spray and shouting and cordite. For more than 1 hour, the fight is brutal and close. Then the U-boat slips astern, broken and burning, and slides under for the last time. The mechanics of victory are plain. SG radar on S-band, with a plan position indicator, gives a stable track and a clean intercept at long night ranges. The bridge watches bearing rate, not just range. The ship closes on the bow to deny the target a clean escape. When clutter eats the picture at very short range, sonar takes the thread and holds it tight. Depth charges tear the pocket of water where the submarine must be. Gunfire and ramming finish what pressure began. Each step is small. Each step is deliberate. Together they form a chain that the U-boat cannot break. Across the escort groups, the drill becomes instinct. Centimetric radar finds. The plan position indicator guides. Helm and engine make fine corrections. Sonar holds the last yards. Forward projectors and throwers strike without revealing light. Guns end the argument if the enemy is forced up. The crew speaks in short phrases and numbers. The ship moves as if one mind. The sea keeps its secrets, but not from a destroyer that can see in the dark. What began as a rough hack with a fixed aerial has matured into a discipline. Yet the spirit has not changed. Keep the lobe, keep the bearing, keep the pressure. The night answers to that cadence.